Hello, everybody. Happy Monday, the 29th of March. My name is Hazel Baker and I run London Guided Walks, and we've got a treat for you tonight. This is our very first ever virtual tour for Financial London. And no, it won't be me doing it. It will be City of London tour guide Ian McDiarmid. He's here with me. Hello, Ian.
Hi, Hazel. Hello, everybody.
All right, I'm really excited about this one, Ian, because as you know, I've done your tour, your actual face-to-face tour, about 3 times already, and there's always so much to learn, isn't it? I don't know how you do it really, and every time it's different. You're always adding new stuff in, including the Brexit stuff has been really exciting to learn about. So you like doing this tour, don't you?
I do. One of the things I find is that when you do the walk in real life, you get a variety of people coming along, and inevitably with doing guided walks, you get sort of what I refer to as partner syndrome, where somebody's dragged along and they don't necessarily want to come along, but they're coming along because their partner wants to come on it. And in a way, their reactions are very good, and I've been very pleased with the reactions to this, and quite surprised really. And I think that some of the people coming on the walk are quite surprised because they weren't anticipating it being interesting. And I think one of the things that will very clearly come out of my talking during the tour is how vitally important the City of London is. And I think that, just as a kind of key obvious conclusion to it, is something that people are often impressed by.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much to learn, and what we've done this time for all of you. I know we've got some new people on today's tour. I know Kath and Trevor have bought gifts for friends to come on the tour today. So brand new to London Guided Walks. So lovely to not see you all. I hope you all got a G&T and making a date night of this. So what we're going to do this virtual tour is that we actually went out onto the streets of London. So instead of a glorified presentation with some videos and maps, I followed Ian with my iPhone and froze my fingers off whilst videoing this. And I think we froze our toes as well, don't we, Ian?
Yes, it was a very cold day, wasn't it?
But the video itself is 54 minutes long, and then we'll also have questions and answers later on. Now you'll be able to see at the bottom, I'd love to hear from all of you. Where you're all from? So here we got, hi Hazel and Ian. Jason is from South Africa. I can't do a South African accent. And oh wow, Monica, and I'm from Finland, so I can't do a Finnish accent. But we both live in West London. Looking forward to the tour, Monica. Thank you so much, Monica and Jason. Lovely to see or not see you both tonight. And then I saw Lisa, you popped up as well. There you go, Lisa. Thank you. I'm glad you got the link in the end. Good to see you. I must admit, I had my memories on my Facebook come up last week, and your face was on it because we did the Hampstead tour. Do you remember that? Oh, I love Miss Hampstead. Haven't been to Hampstead for over a year. So now lockdown today is the first day that we're able to sort of peer out of our houses, and so our private tours are now available for only up to 5 people plus the tour guide 6. So if you're wanting to get out and you're wanting to maybe do the financial tour in person, then Ian is very willing and waiting. He's already been jabbed and to do financial tour as well as Roman tour and medieval London. So you do a vast array of things, Ian. I can't keep up with you. All right. So without further ado, please do also send us your little where you're from shout outs, but also if you have any questions, or if you have shout outs, like you want to say hello to someone that actually is watching at the same time from across the globe, then we're very happy to do that, because this is a community after all, and this event is bespoke. It is for you. So the more interaction that we get from you, the better. So if you have any questions or you have any comments, then please do text or WhatsApp. I also have the comments available on YouTube if you do have a login to be able to comment there, so I'll be able to see them. And And then I'll put the questions to Ian, and he'll do his best, I'm sure, to answer them. All
Yes.
right.
Hazel, sorry, just to interrupt. Is it worth just making clear that and make clear for me as well, because at the end we'll watch the film and then we'll have a session afterwards for the questions. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we'll watch it all the way through, and then hopefully that will be that plenty of people have got comments and questions as they're going, and they can send those over while we're watching the video, so then I can collate them to send to you at the end of the video.
Okay.
All right, does that sound like a plan, Stan?
Yep.
All right, so any other technical issues as well, please do send me a text or a WhatsApp to this number. Please don't call, because it's all interlinked with the internet. And if you, including, we're going to disappear now and play the video, and I want to make sure that everyone can hear it as well. So to quote Schwarzenegger, we'll be back. All right.
Hello, my name's Ian McDiarmid, and we're going to be going on a walk around the City of London today. Financial services are a hugely important part of the British economy, accounting for fully 10% of UK GDP. And in today's walk, we're going to be looking at the origins of the City of London, and we're going to be looking at the component parts that generate all this wealth. Now, because it does account for 10% of GDP, the city has been one of the unqualified successes of the British economy over the past 3 or 4 decades. Unqualified but not uncontested, because with that success come 2 big problems in particular. The first is systemic risk. Financial companies, when they get into difficulty, can bring down huge swathes of the economy, and in particular they bring down their creditors, and their creditors include other banks. And for this reason, governments and central banks feel obliged to step in general when they get into difficulty. And this causes great resentment amongst the public, who have to pay out all the money to bail out these feckless bankers. The second problem is one of rising inequality in Britain, and the people who work in the city in front of you in general tend to be extremely well paid, and their work, as I say, is not always appreciated, and this creates again a lot of resentment. But the crucial thing to remember is that apart from contributing 10% to the UK's GDP, financial services also contribute about 10% to the tax take. So a lot of the social services that are paid for all around the country, schools and the rest of it, are financed from a lot of the activity that's going on in front of you. Now, when we talk about the city, it's a bit of a vague term, and we're really talking about 3 things. The most obvious one is the physical presence of the city, which corresponds with the London as it developed historically. So when we talk about the city as a geographical place, we're talking about the old city boundaries of London, which include the city walls, but they extend beyond a little bit the old city walls to what were known as the bars, the gates to the city. And this area, the city narrowly defined as a piece of geography, also fits in with the area governed by the Corporation of London, which is the local authority covering this part of the capital. The second meaning of the city refers to financial services in London. Now, this has become a little bit complicated because over the past few decades 2 other centres have developed. The smaller one is in Mayfair in the West End, which is where the UK's hedge funds are located, and UK hedge funds are the largest in Europe. They're not very big by American standards, but they're important. And the more important financial centre is over to the east of here, which is Docklands, Canary Wharf, which developed as a rival financial centre in the 1980s. And the big advantage of Canary Wharf is that the rents are a bit cheaper and it's a bit easier to get very, very big space. And then finally, the third meaning of the City of London is financial services in general for the UK. And I think in the course of this walk, probably be using all 3 terms, but it'll be very clear whenever I refer to the city which one I am referring to. You can see the cluster of the city's tallest buildings, and these lie just slightly to the east of the city, and this is where we're going to be beginning our walk proper. And in front of you, you can see a couple of the landmark modern buildings that have gone up in the city. The big one in front of you with the curves and the silver immediately to the foreground is the walkie-talkie. And for our purposes, one thing important to note here is that although this is a general office, quite a few of the tenants are involved in insurance. And then just to the right of that, again, you can see another building which is important because it has a lot of insurance tenants in it, which is the Cheese Grater by Richard Rogers. And then to the right of that, you can see the angular building, which is composed of triangles. That's a very recent one called the Scalpel. And again, that is very important for insurance because that's the headquarters of Barclay, an American insurance company. And then just to the right of that, and slightly obscured, or mainly obscured, you can see the outside edge of the Gherkin, which is the headquarters of Swiss Reinsurance. And we'll be starting our walk just to the right of the Cheese Grater. This is the start of our walk, and in front of you you can see to your left the Commercial Union building, now the Aviva building, and just to the right of that you can see the Gherkin, which we were looking at before. And then as we move our way around, you will see the Church of St Andrew undershaft, and then over the road you will see the Scalpel, which we were looking at before. And then there's a little road running down Lime Street, and you can see the Willis building to your left. And then finally, as we come round to our right, we'll arrive at the Lloyd's building. And all of these buildings, with the exception of the church, are associated with insurance. And we are in the insurance quarter of the City of London. And it might be worth explaining why we have a quarter dedicated to insurance. About 40 years ago, if you were wandering around this part of the city, it would be absolutely full of insurance brokers, and you can still see some of them today doing this. And they are readily recognisable because they carry huge briefcases absolutely stuffed full of paper under their arms. And they can't possibly shut the briefcases, there's too much paper, they can't use the handles, so they have to carry them a bit like that, and they look rather like orangutans. And it's because they need to carry all this paper around, it's a face-to-face market, or was a face-to-face market, that all these insurance companies are close together. Now the reason the quarter grew up here is because the Lloyd's building, which you saw earlier on across the street and which we'll be going to next, on that site in the 18th century and early 19th century was the East India Company, and the East India Company ran the largest commercial shipping fleet in the world. And commercial, as opposed to a military or a navy fleet of ships, was an insurable fleet of ships. So the largest insurable fleet of ships was run from just across the road from here, and if you're in insurance you wanted to be near there. The London insurance market is made up of three elements. You've got the general insurance companies, you've got the reinsurance companies, which you will find anywhere, and you have a third element which is unique to London, Lloyd's. Now together all of this insurance activity added up makes London the largest centre for insurance in Europe and the fourth largest in the world. And we'll go on now and we'll look at this unique institution of London, Lloyd's. The Lloyd's building was completed in 1986 by the architect Richard Rogers, and it's the first example of a style that he pioneered in this country, along with Renzo Piano in Paris, the Pompidou Centre, and it is known, though not by Rogers himself, as Bowelism. And Bowelism is a descriptive name for the style of building whereby you put the outside services, things like the lift shafts, the toilets, cranes at the top, the air conditioning on the outside. And according to Rogers, this makes for a pleasing looking building, but it also has the practical benefit of freeing up the inside to make a large free space. And inside Lloyd's there's this great open space which they call the atrium. Now when we're talking about modern buildings in London, architectural journalists fall back on two cliches, iconic and signature. We'll be looking at a signature building later on. This one is always described as iconic, and it is iconic in the sense that when walking around here you can see lots of foreign students making notes about the building, and it's also iconic in the sense that it has left a very deep mark on the landscape of London. Because it's now the better part of 40 years old, perhaps we begin to take it for granted. But if you have a look at the original doorway to the 1920s Lloyd's building, which Rogers left in part, which is the typical architecture which you associate with financial institutions, i.e. rather safe, rather classical, trying to embody strength and perhaps conservatism. And you can contrast that with the building that Rogers put around it. You can see how revolutionary this building was in the 1980s. And this was a great move for Lloyd's because it means that they appear to be innovative, ahead of the times, and a dynamic marketplace. Now, Lloyd's is unique, as I was saying. It's actually, and I've already used the word, it's a marketplace rather than a company. And it's unique in the way it does business. So the insurance is actually undertaken by syndicates. They're the people who arrange the insurance, and with the outside world through brokers. And this system of syndicate by companies plus the brokers, in theory, gives Lloyd's great flexibility. And Lloyd's does the whole range of insurance business, but it's particularly associated with individual idiosyncratic high-end risks. So if you wanted to insure a satellite, for example, Lloyd's might very well be your first stop. And this also feeds into some of the policies that Lloyd's is well known for popularly, to do with celebrities. For example, it has insured Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. It's insured his fingers. Now, I suspect that these policies are more to do with publicity, both for the individual concerned and for the insurance company, but they reflect this ability to underwrite things that other people may not be equipped for. If we go back into the money behind Lloyd's came from the names, and the names were wealthy individuals, and they signed up for, they put the money behind the syndicates, and in most years, the good years when Lloyd's was making money, they simply received a cheque and probably forgot all about it. And then in the 1980s, things went horribly wrong. Lloyd's suffered a series of disastrous losses. The Exxon Valdez, big oil tanker ran aground in a lab. There were hurricanes, and above all, there was the beginning of asbestosis litigation, and Lloyd's lost a lot of money. And these names, who had unlimited liability, suddenly had to stump up the money, and a lot of them were made bankrupt. Now, one can argue this both ways in terms of sympathy or not. They'd signed on the dotted line. I don't recall names complaining about the money they were making. Years were good, but we also have to acknowledge that though they were legally on the hook, this was a human disaster. Quite a few of them took their own lives as a result of these losses. Furthermore, some of the names took Lloyd's to court, and they alleged that some of the professionals working in Lloyd's had stuffed the names, these wealthy individuals, into the poorer syndicates, that basically there had been fraudulent activity going on. Now, these claims were settled out of court, but the aftermath of that has lingered on. As a result, Lloyd's suffered at this time what appeared to be a catastrophic blow to its reputation, but it survived, it reformed. And one of the main reforms it made was to get rid of individual names as people backing the underwriting, and since that time the syndicates have been made up of corporate members. Over recent years, Lloyd's has run into problems again, however. Recently it has been the scene for widespread allegations of sexual misconduct, And Lloyd's, part of its endeavours to clear up its act, it conducted a survey of its employers, and this survey revealed that the problems that it was facing were even more widespread than it could have anticipated. From an economic point of view, Lloyd's has been suffering because its margins are slimmer than those of the general insurance companies. And outsiders blame this on two main problems. The first is this structure whereby business has to be done through brokers, which adds on an extra level of complexity, an extra level of cost. The second reason that Lloyd's hasn't been as profitable as other insurance companies is that it's been slow to adopt digitisation. So earlier on I was talking about these insurance brokers who still who wander around with these huge wads of paper under their arms, and I mentioned that you could still see some of these today. Now it's remarkable that you can still see people conducting business like this today. And so Lloyd's really has to modernise and be innovative in order to assure its future. Now the origins of Lloyd's lie in a famous coffee house, and the coffee houses are of enormous importance to the historical development of London as a financial centre. And we'll go and look at those origins next. And we're going to be walking down Leadenhall Street. We're going to be walking down Leadenhall Street to the west, and then we're going to be crossing over and entering a little triangle of land bordered by Cornhill to the north, Gracechurch Street to the east, and Lombard Street to the south. And as you'll see, we're going to go into a rather magical part of the city that's full of narrow little alleyways and which has no sign indicating the importance of the events that took place there. This is the Jamaica Wine Bar, and this is of enormous importance to the history of London and indeed England, because this is the site of London's first coffee house, and it may well have been England's first coffee house. And this is set up by a man named Pasqua Rosé in the 1650s, and he is the Greek-speaking assistant to an Englishman. It's probable that the English merchant provided the capital for this venture. And this really took off, and very quickly Pasqua Rosé was selling 600 dishes of coffee a day. And from this start, the coffee house phenomenon took off. And by 1700, London may well have had 1,000 coffee houses. And this really was a phenomenon that was almost unique to London. So the coffee houses get going in the Ottoman Empire. Other cities have them, but they have much, much fewer than London. And of those 1,000 coffee houses, the greatest concentration is in this area of the city. And this site where Pasqua Rosé had originally established his first place selling coffee later on became a permanent coffee house, which was known as the Jamaica, and hence the name of this wine bar. Now, for our purposes, the development of London as a financial centre, two types of coffee houses were very important, and this was the first type. And this was a type of coffee house where traders from a particular area would meet, and they would meet to discuss and to do business. And the merchants meeting here were West India merchantmen. And there was a whole series of coffee houses like this in this area. So just around the corner from here was the Jerusalem, where traders from the Middle East would meet. Near here, for example, was one called the Virginia and Baltic. And these are very important for our story because it is the wealth of these merchants that will feed into the developing financial markets here. The merchants are, or at least some of them, extremely wealthy. So from the late 17th and particularly in the early 18th century, England begins to become the wealthiest, most successful economy in the world, and this success is largely built upon overseas trade. And the second kind of coffee house was the kind of coffee house where they could go to invest some of that money, and we'll go and look at that kind of coffee house next. sign up here is all that there is to indicate that this is the site of one of the most famous coffee houses of the lot, Garraways, and we're standing now in Change Alley, which is the main thoroughfare within this of land that I was describing earlier. And Change Alley gave its name to the first Change Alley. They were talking about this triangle of land as a whole. Now, Garraways is established in the 1660s, and it's a general coffee house. People come here to discuss all kinds of things, to meet their friends, and also, however, it's an important place for the auctioning off of commodities. And this process begins in the 1660s with Hudson Bay merchants who meet here to auction off beaver pelts. But later on it becomes a general place for the sale of all kinds of things. So Garraway is the first person in London to sell tea, for example. And auctions at Garraway's, as at other coffee houses, were by candle. And this was a process whereby an auctioneer would insert a pin into a candle, the candle would be lit, and as long as the candle burnt down to the pin, that was the period in which bids could be shouted out for whatever was being auctioned off. And this gives rise to an expression in English which a lot of people use, and they're probably not quite sure what its origins were. And you can imagine that if there was an auction and it wasn't very successful, that if there was some tea for sale and then perhaps it was the 8th auction of tea of the day, then during this period when the auctioneer lit the candle and asked for the bids to be shouted out, that nobody would actually make any noise. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. But it wasn't just commodities that were auctioned off here. People could come here and they could buy shares and bonds, and this was also true of an even more famous coffee shop for the transacting of shares, and that was Jonathan's, which was just round the corner from here. So this is the site of Jonathan's in this rather unprepossessing members club now, and Jonathan's is of enormous importance because, as I was saying, shares were traded here in Jonathan's, they were traded in other coffee houses in this area as well, but Jonathan's comes to absolutely dominate the market. And in the 18th century, the people meeting at Jonathan's got rather fed up with the by the small space of the premises, but also they got fed up with the general public coming in to watch what they were doing. And it's at that point that they move off, find new premises, and that is the origins of the London Stock Exchange. Now, one of the things that happens in Jonathan's quite early on is that a man named Carstang produces a list of prices, and so people within easy reach of London, within a day's ride or so, can easily monitor the prices of the securities being traded here. So what kind of securities were traded here at the end of the 17th and into the early 18th centuries? Well, crucial to the story is the foundation of the Bank of England in 1694. And the Bank of England issues two kinds of paper. It issues shares in itself, which is its initial way of raising money for the government. And from that point on, it then issues and refinances bonds. And those bonds and those shares are the most important securities traded here. Also, you've got the East India Company, which is an enormously important, the most important company of this time, and their shares were traded a great deal here. But also from the 1690s, you get a vogue for what we would call startups. So they had men called projectors, who we would call entrepreneurs, and they had all kinds of schemes for setting up new companies, and they were a great fashion. Now, most of these folded, and a lot of them were clearly fraudulent. And there's one famous story of a scheme that went round the coffee houses, of a scheme that was so ingenious that no one was to know what it was. And this, I think, probably clearly is a satire. It's people in the coffee houses taking the fun out of this new vogue for new companies which had little foundation. But a lot of this was obviously quite close to the truth, because a lot of modern historians have actually thought that this scheme for which nobody was to know what it actually was actually a true company. We're now going to look at our final coffee house, which was perhaps the most famous of the lot, Lloyd's. Lloyd opened his coffee house in Great Tower Street, which is by the River Thames, and that might seem a logical place to have a coffee house that was to become so closely associated with insurance. And it's from this coffee house that Lloyd's, where we were visiting earlier on, originates. Lloyd's moves up to here, however, in the 1690s, and it's to be just close to where we've just been, that little triangle of land where there's all this money going around to be invested. And as I mentioned, Lloyd's Coffee House becomes synonymous with marine insurance, and people gather there, experts gather there to undertake the insuring of ships. Now, the way maritime insurance worked then was that you wouldn't want to put all of your money into one ship, and instead what you would do is you would be insuring 1/8 or 1/12 of a ship, and they would write the name of the ship on the top of a piece of paper. You would write your name underneath that, and you would hence become an underwriter. So what we've seen is in this narrow triangle of land, and Lloyd's here is just a road from there, you have the development in the 1690s, from the 1690s onwards, gathering momentum in the early 18th century, of a whole series of modern financial markets. You've got the development of the bond market, you've got the development of the share market, you've got the auctioning of commodities, and you've got insurance. And these developments are often collectively known as the financial revolution, because this is the first time that you have modern financial markets. So people can come in here, they can invest their money in what we would call paper securities, shares, bonds, and the rest of it, and they could also come here and sell them. So you've got all these coffee houses where wealthy merchants are meeting, and they've got money to invest. But you'd also have people riding here, travelling here from all parts of the country to go into these coffee houses and invest. And not only is this of enormous importance in itself, because you can buy, you can sell, but also really for the first time, you've got an alternative to, if you're wealthy, investing your money in land. And these markets have persisted through to the present day. So at this time in the late 17th and early 18th century, London becomes the biggest financial marketplace in the world. And today it remains the main centre in Europe for the trading of bonds, the trading of equities, and the trading of commodities. And one crucial aspect of this has been in the trading of shares is that London is the main centre for where all kinds of international shares are traded. So the main centre in Europe for the trading of American shares and Asian shares is here in London. And it has been, for the past decades, the main centre for the trading of European shares. But that all vanished overnight in January 2021 as a result of Brexit. And this represents a considerable threat to the City of London. London can afford the loss of the trading of European equities, but it can't afford a continual chipping away of markets. And this is the big worry about this loss of European share trading. But we'll now go and look at another development that's important historically for the development of the international bond market. So we talked over there about the Bank of England. That is the development of what would later be known as gilts, British government bonds, but we'll now go and look at the origins of the international bond market. This is New Court, which was founded as the counting house of Nathan Rothschild in 1806. Now, the Rothschilds were an amazingly successful banking family. Nathan's father, Meyer Amschel, had been an antiques dealer in Frankfurt. He had got into finance through financing a lot of princes who wanted to get their money out of Germany ahead of Napoleon coming in. And he sent 4 of his sons off to different cities. So Nathan came here, James to Paris, and then other sons went to Paris and Vienna, and one stayed with him in Frankfurt. And they became the most successful banking family of the 19th century. And the symbol of the Rothschilds is 5 arrows bound together. Those 5 arrows are the 5 brothers, and they acted together basically as a multinational bank. And as I said, they were far and away ahead of any other bank at the time. So investment banks today, they jostle for the lead position. One year it might be JP Morgan, another year it was Goldman Sachs. In the 19th century, it was always Rothschilds, and Rothschilds were so far, way ahead of the competition. Now, one of the things that Nathan does here, one of his great innovations, is he launches a bond for the King of Prussia in 1818. One of Nathaniel's great innovations is that in 1818 he issues a bond on behalf of the King of Prussia. And before this date, if some foreign government wanted to raise money, it would do so through a loan. And the problem with a loan is that you're getting the money all from one person or one individual. And the great advantage with a bond is that you can raise money from lots and lots of people, because the bond is like a loan, but it's divided up into bond certificates. And these bonds can be sold to institutions and members of the public. And apart from getting the King of Prussia to borrow his money through the form of a bond, this bond was denominated in sterling, unusual for a European government to do, but also it was governed by English law to give reassurance to investors, and crucially the coupon payments, the annual payment on the bond, were payable here in London. And so this was a great way of getting the investors in that part of London that we're talking about, that magical triangle of land around Change Alley. They could also invest in this bond issued by the King of Prussia, and this was a huge huge success. It meant that the King of Prussia was able to raise the money he wanted to easily, and he could raise it more cheaply than he could have done through the form of a loan. And very quickly this is followed on by issues for Austria and for Russia, and this is really the beginnings of the international bond market. And as I say, it's an innovation of Nathan's Rothschild. And London has dominated the international bond market ever since. N.M. Rothschild is still here today, and it's the one part of the Rothschild empire to have survived, and its continued history reflects upon the political stability within Britain compared to European countries. And we're now going to look at a way politics is important to the city from a more local point of view. This Mansion House is the ceremonial home of the Lord Mayor of the City of London. And the Lord Mayor is the head of the corporation, and he represents London in selling financial services. And this brings us on to how the City of London is governed, because the City of London is separate from the rest of London in terms of administration. London is made up of 32 boroughs plus the Corporation of London. The rest of London, these 32 boroughs, come under the Mayor of London. Here we are and this is important because the government of the city has always been one that is favourable to commerce and to commercial activities. And the institution of the office of Lord Mayor was a very important part of this in the Middle Ages. The first Lord Mayor is appointed under Richard I, Fitz-Aylwin, and then it's under his brother John that the key concessions are made. And when I say concessions, the Crown is always desperate for money, raising money. John is particularly impecunious, and it's he who grants the crucial concessions. And the crucial concessions are that the Londoners appoint their own mayor, and secondly, he's only elected for 1 year, which means that he can't become too powerful. And London, headed by the Lord Mayor, was essentially run by a wealthy oligarchy of merchants. So London, with these concessions from the Crown, was essentially run in the interests of merchants. And if we fast forward to the present day, the City of London is still very much run with business in mind. And it has this very peculiar attribute to it, in that it is the one local authority where the votes go to businesses. So the people who represent the wards in London, who then go and sit on the council, the Corporation of London, are elected by businesses. And one might make the rather obvious criticism that this is undemocratic. However, it would be difficult to have a fully flourishing democracy here in the City of London, because there's only about 11,000 people who live here. And as I say, the advantage of this does mean that it is the voice of business that is very much heard by the local authority that runs this area. One important aspect of the city is not just the trading here, but all the ancillary services that go on alongside the main financial market activity. And we'll go and look at some of those ancillary services next. In front of you is the Bloomberg building, the headquarters of Bloomberg here in London. And when we were outside the Lloyd's building, we were talking about architectural critics using cliches like iconic. Well, the cliche employed here is signature. And by signature, these journalists just mean a building that is supposed to be very good and very expensive, but not to dominate the environment, to fit in with the environment. And Bloomberg spent £1 billion on this building, making it the most expensive building in terms of construction. So 40 years ago, if you were working in the bond market and you wanted to know what the yield, the return on a bond was, you would consult a huge book of bond yields, which would give you for a certain price for a bond with a maturity and a certain coupon, you could look up the yield. And about 40 years ago, they developed bond market calculators. The maths on the return of a bond is quite complicated. And you used to be able to walk around with these brick-like contraptions which would tell you the yield. And then Bloomberg introduced his terminals, which told you the yield on a bond almost instantly. But not only the yield, they also told you more complicated calculations that you need if you're trading bonds for technical things that are known as duration and convexity. But also you were able to run graphs. You were able to run the price of one security against another. So you might think that one particular bond was looking cheap. Well, on the Bloomberg terminal, you could very quickly run the price, a graph showing you the history of that bond against another. And the terminal just instantly did a whole load of calculations that you just needed, just so useful to anybody trading bonds. And from bonds, he expanded into equities and other areas of financial markets. And later on, he made a move into news. And Bloomberg is today a very important purveyor of news and, of course, of analytics. And joining him on the provision of news has always been Reuters. So Reuters was established in the 19th century. You can see the 1920s headquarters of Reuters, designed by Lutyens in Fleet Street today. And Reuters made an attempt later on to move into analytics, but it was never as successful as Bloomberg. And then in addition, on the news, you've also got the Financial Times, which has recently moved back into the City of London. So in addition to analytics and news, we've also got the ratings agencies. Now, the ratings agencies aren't located here in the city, they're located in Canary Wharf. But there are two large ratings agencies, that's Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and they're joined by a third smaller one, Fitch. And ratings are enormously important. They give you a quick score indicating the creditworthiness of somebody making an issue in the bond market. And one important use of these credit ratings is to be able to control bond fund managers. So if you hand your money over to a bond fund manager, you probably want to control the degree of risk he's taking. And you might well want to say, I'm happy for you to manage my money, but you can only invest in AAA rated bonds, and AAA are the best rated bonds that are available. And the way the scoring system works is that it starts with AAA, it then goes on to AA plus, AA minus, BBB, and so on, all the way down to D for default. And we're now going to go and look at British banking, which the city is obviously very important. And we're going to look at the headquarters of what, just after the First World War, was the largest bank in the world. This is Portree, and in front of you is the Ned, which is a hotel and a cocktail bar, and when it's open you can go into the cocktail bar. And it's worth doing because this was built by the well-known architect Lutyens in the 1920s as the headquarters for the Midland Bank. And as I was mentioning earlier, the Midland Bank in 1919 was the largest bank in the world. And the Midland Bank, along with NatWest, Lloyds and Barclays, were the four big clearing banks, the four banks which dominated British banking in the 20th century. And in the forms of their successors, the four clearing banks still do dominate the domestic banking landscape. And if we go back to when this building was put up, the way that regulation occurred in the city was largely through the chief executives of these four big banks meeting informally with the Bank of England, and hence in part the importance of this site, because we are very, very close to the Bank of England, and it's very easy for the chief executive of the Midland Bank here to pop over the road and to visit the governor in the Bank of England. Now these four banks, as I say, are still dominant today, and they had a very bad time during the 2008 financial crisis, and they're very much diminished from what they used to be. Diminished in the terms of their market capitalisation, the value of their shares outstanding, but also diminished in terms of their ambition. This particular bank, Midland Bank, made a disastrous foray in the 1970s into America when it bought Crocker National Bank, and was subsequently taken over by HSBC. And HSBC did relatively well during the 2008 crisis, largely because it had its successful Asian banking operations to rely on. But since the 2008 crisis, it's very much reduced its investment banking ambitions, and also now the bank itself is subject to an internal debate as to whether it should focus on its Asian operations and perhaps even split up the two parts of its banking empire. And if it actually does that, I mean, we might actually see the return of the Midland name. Of the other big clearers, NatWest was taken over by RBS, and RBS was the bank that did the worst out of the financial crisis. It was an absolute disaster, headed by Fred Goodwin, and what Goodwin did was that at the height of the speculative boom in asset-backed paper, he bought a lot of these what would turn out to be toxic assets from ABN AMRO at the top of the market, and basically blew the barn doors off his bank, and RBS had to be bailed out by the taxpayer. And it's very much a diminished shadow of its former self, and is still largely owned by the British government. Lloyds should have been the safest of these banks because it was largely focused on domestic banking and therefore wasn't involved in the ABS market, the asset-backed security market, which was at the heart of the 2008 crisis. But it had its arm twisted by the government into buying HBOS, and HBOS was absolutely full of very dodgy corporate loans. And again, as I say, Lloyds Bank never really had international ambitions, but it is very much a smaller bank than it was prior to the crisis. That leaves us with one remaining big clearing bank, Barclays. Now Barclays managed to get through the crisis without turning to the government. It did raise money from the Middle East, and that Middle Eastern fundraising was then later scrutinised by the by the authorities. And Barclays remains the one British bank which has ambitions in investment banking, and it normally ranks somewhere about 6th, but it's been under a lot of pressure from shareholders recently to abandon its investment banking operations. But it's still there, and it's the one remnant of one British-owned bank that still has ambitions in the international banking market. We'll now go and look at a building which a lot of Londoners pass and which very few of them, I think, know what it was actually built for: the Royal Exchange. The Royal Exchange was founded in 1571 by Sir Thomas Gresham, and on the pediment in front of you it says in Latin that it was founded in the 13th year of the reign of Elizabeth and restored in the 8th year of Queen Victoria. Now, that use of the word restored in Latin is a little bit loose. In fact, there were two earlier buildings on this site: Gresham's, which was destroyed by a fire in 1666, and then a new building put up by the architect Jarman, which was destroyed by a fire in the 1830s. So basically, when the Victorian building was put up, and it was designed by Sir William Tite, it was a complete rebuild. But nevertheless, these three buildings have followed the same footprint, and that's important for our story, because the Royal Exchange, and you can go in there today, is essentially a courtyard, and the roof was open until very, very recently. And the importance of the courtyard was the peristyle running round it, which was covered and was where traders would meet to do their deals, and the importance was that this was a covered area. We have a description by John Stowe, who wrote a Chronicle of London in 1598, in which he says the merchants, the foreign merchants of London, used to meet in Lombard Street, immediately to the south of here, which was open to the elements and therefore very inconvenient. Now, the area inside the Royal Exchange was divided up into walks. So you had, for example, you had Spaniards Walk, you had the Norwegian Walk, you had Virginia Walk, and so these were the areas where the people trading with a particular part of the globe would meet to do their deals. Now, there are two important things that traders need. They need foreign exchange and they need credit. The main means of credit in the 18th and 19th centuries was the Bill of Exchange. Now, the Bill of Exchange is a piece of paper saying something along the lines of, I will pay the bearer £100 in 3 months' time. And these bits of paper would be sold at a discount. So, for example, somebody would buy it at 99 3/4, and they would make their money by the appreciation of price over the life of that piece of paper. And there's one problem with the way I have described this, and that is that if I was to issue this piece of paper, people wouldn't know who I was and they'd be worried about my credit. And so it was a fairly natural development for these pieces of paper to be issued by well-known bankers on behalf of traders. And this business of traders going up to well-known bankers like Nathan Rothschild and getting them to issue bills of exchange on their behalf was known as accepting. And Nathan Rothschild could be found within the Royal Exchange on his own pillar, and dealing in these bills of exchange was his main business. So when we were talking earlier about the innovations in the bond market, this was one of the areas where Nathan Rothschild really made a huge amount of money. But in terms of the everyday business, in terms of huge volumes, fairly low margin business, this was what Rothschild spent a lot of his day doing. And as I say, he could be found at his own pillar. The other thing that traders need is foreign exchange, and the foreign exchange market here in London developed around this area where I'm standing now in the 18th and 19th centuries. And initially the foreign exchange dealers would meet here from Tuesday to Friday. Now, these two developments, the bills of exchange and the foreign exchange, are the origins of the modern markets here in London. So the money markets, and the money markets are defined as trading in instruments which are up to 12 months in maturity, is absolutely huge. But it's the foreign exchange market that really is one of London's great success stories, and 40% of global trading in foreign exchange occurs here in London. This is absolutely enormous, and London is by far and away the largest centre for foreign exchange trading in the world. We'll now go on and look at one of London's best known institutions, the Bank of England. The Bank of England is made up of two architectural components. The upper bit was designed by Herbert Baker in the 1930s, and the bit below, the more interesting part, is designed by Sir John Soane in the 19th century. And Baker essentially destroyed most of Soane's work, described by Nicholas Pevsner, the great architectural historian, as the greatest act of vandalism in 20th century London's architecture. But from our point of view, what's important is that the two architectural elements of this building have basically the same flavour. They're both fortress-like, very strong, and this is important for central banks which like to convey an impression of reliability, conservatism and strength. When the bank was founded in 1694, its main function was to raise money for the government, and it did this by selling shares in itself. Later in the course of the 18th century, it became known as the issuing agent, and this meant that the Bank of England would issue bonds in its name but would do so on behalf of the government. And this system was incredibly successful, largely because in England it was Parliament that held the reins of power in terms of finance. It was Parliament that voted taxation, and the members of Parliament were all, were in large measures holders of this Bank of England paper, either the shares or the bonds that were issued, and perhaps more importantly, so were their constituents, which meant that all the people with financial power in the country had a vested interest in making sure that the Bank of England didn't fail. Now, this contrasted with the situation in continental Europe, and in particular in France, where you had absolute monarchs, and they could declare bankruptcy. They could simply refuse to honour their debts, and if you were a creditor of the King of France, you were just absolutely wiped out. And this meant that England was able to raise money far more cheaply than the French. And the British are fighting a series of long, gruelling wars with the French from the 1690s right through to 1815. And eventually, England emerges a victor in these wars. And if you had said to Louis XIV at the beginning of this process that in just over 100 years' time, England is going to defeat you, he'd have probably been amazed. He had the King of England in his pocket at this time, Charles II. The King of England was actually a pensioner of the King of France. And it is through the institution of the Bank of England that England is able to borrow money far more cheaply than the French, and in spite of having a much smaller economy, was able to defeat France over the longer term. The second important function of the Bank of England was to act as lender of last resort, and it first did this in the 1820s when there was one of numerous emerging market crises that would affect the British economy. And in the 1820s, a lot of the financial houses here in London had become overextended in Latin America. There was a crash, and the economy, it was said, was within 24 hours of being reduced to a state of barter. And the Bank of England stepped in, and it made known that it would provide liquidity to any financial houses that needed it in London. And the last time it did this was in the 2008 financial crisis, when it bailed out Lloyds Bank and RBS. The third function of the Bank of England is to set interest rates, and this was a function that was handed over to the Bank of England in 1997 when New Labour came to power. And one of the first things they did was to give the Bank of England operational independence. And interest rates are set by the Monetary Policy Committee, which is a 9-member committee and which meets once a month. And the Bank of England is targeted with trying to achieve an inflation rate of 2%. As a consequence of the financial crisis, interest rates were cut to near zero. And when you get rates that low, conventional monetary policy doesn't work anymore, because if you cut interest rates to less money than they're lending out, and they don't really have much incentive to lend, which is the whole purpose of cutting rates. You're trying to stimulate lending. And the Bank of England, along with other central banks, embarked on a policy of quantitative easing. And so this has been another important role of the Bank of England since the 2008 crisis, and again during the crisis associated with COVID-19. It has been buying up billions of the most important as a role model for other central banks. But in addition to this, the Bank of England has several other important functions that it carries out. As our central bank, the Bank of England looks after the country's gold reserves, which are held in the basement here, and it also looks after the gold reserves of other countries. The West German state kept all of its gold reserves here up until the time of unification. The Bank of England is responsible for intervening in the currency markets when Britain does this. This is not something it's done for a long time, but when it does it through the Bank of England. The Bank of England operates as the government's own bank, so when the government pays for something, it does it through the Bank of England. And finally, the Bank of England is responsible for the design of our coins and notes in circulation. The Bank of England has the important responsibility of trying to ensure financial stability, and it does this through an arm of itself, the Prudential Regulation Authority. Now, financial regulation in this country is split into two bodies, the PRA and the Financial Conduct Authority. And the PRA is responsible for deposit-taking institutions and, in essence, is responsible for the important banks, whereas the FCA looks after the more orientated part of the market. Well, thank you very much for coming on the tour today. One rather obvious thing to say in concluding the walk is that we've only covered a very, very short distance. We started off at St Mary Axe, we've ended up here at the Bank of England, and the short distance that we've walked summed up, really in some important way, sums up the importance of this incredibly small area of London, not just to London's success, but to the development of financial markets in the world as a whole.
There we go. How about that then? So much to see and understand. Now, if you have any questions, Ian is here and willing to answer as best as he possibly can. So please do send me a text or a WhatsApp if you've got anything there. I did get a WhatsApp saying that it was a little bit jittery. So apologies for that. But what I will do is I will send you a link to the pre-recorded video, so you can jump to the bits that you maybe missed, if any of you did do that. So we've had the first comment through from Monica and Jason. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, thank you, Ian, for that.
Thank you, Monica and Jason. Thank you. Good.
Yeah, good to always have feedback. Let's have a look. What else have we got? So I can see, Lisa, that you're typing. I'll wait patiently for that one. But if anybody else has any questions or comments, don't forget that the Bank of England has actually got a museum. It's open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 normally. So hopefully they'll reopen post-COVID. And they have in there, they have a gold bar, which you can actually try and pick up and get to see how heavy it is. So whenever you see any of those movies where they're throwing gold bars, you know, Ocean's 11 or whatever, a load of rubbish, they're so heavy. And also you can steer a ship and try and work out how to do inflation, which was a really good practical way of understanding the complexity there. Lisa, wonderful. Hazel and Ian, thank you very much. No, thank you very much, Lisa. It's so lovely to, you're in Canada and you're still able to join us. I miss you so much, and our little chats on our walks. And that's one of the things, isn't it, with modern technology, you never know what you're going to get in terms of live. But as I said, I'll send you a little email after the tour with login details for you to access the video itself. So if there was anything that you did miss by any internet connections and whatever, then you'll be able to have a little look at it in your own time. So anybody else? You're all being very quiet today. Is this because we've had too much sunshine at lunch time? I can scratching up on my cheeks now because I actually used these for the first time this year. How amazing is that? All right, well, if you're going to stay quiet and there's no questions, you've obviously just overwhelmed them, Ian, with your knowledge.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Lisa, for your kind comment. And thanks everybody for watching it, and apologies for the I think, Hazel, you called it juttering. Is that a technical term?
No, someone said that they were experiencing stuttering, so I wanted to pause it to try and catch it up. But where the issue was, but hey ho, modern technology, eh? All right then, guys, so in 2 weeks we have our next virtual tour, which is Susan, and she's looking at the heritage of over 200 years worth of a Regent's Canal from Angel tube station to London Fields. But if you want to hear more about financial London, then Ian has actually done 4 different podcast episodes which you can listen to absolutely free. The episodes are only 20 minutes each, and you can listen if you can watch podcasts, and the 4 that are sort of financial related, because we're on episode 48 now. I can't believe it. Over 30,000 downloads. So the episodes are at 11, London's coffee houses and commerce. Episode 19, London's coffee houses. Number 27, the South Sea bubble. And also number 36, Brexit in the city, which was a real eye-opener, Ian. So each of those are 20 minutes worth. That means you get 80 minutes more free content if you so wish it. As I said, private tours are now available, and we will hope to be opening to public tours again on the 21st of June. So watch this space. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And as I said, I will ping you an email with the link. Oh, here we go. Fantastic regarding podcasts. Catch up soon. So knowledgeable. Ian is so knowledgeable, Ian. There you go. That's Monica. That's Monica and Jason again. I think it's a little fan club. And what other tours do you do, Ian, just so everybody knows that you're not just the finance guy? No,
well, when Hazel puts up the adverts for us, she's very keen to show that we are qualified London guides, and I'm qualified. The course I did was on the City of London, and so anything really to do with the City of London all the way through is my main thing. So Roman London, medieval London. So I concentrate on the city, but I do go outside of the city. I do one in King's Cross as well, which I find interesting, but principally in the city. So the things that really interest me are finance, but also perhaps rather oddly, old history, old meaning before the 19th century. I mean, I love all of history. I love the 19th and 20th century, but particularly the older stuff. Yeah, fantastic. And there are 8 of us guides available for you. So check us all out on the website, or of course you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram and get your daily kicks from us there. All right, thank you again. Have a lovely evening. Hope you're on your second G&T by now, and hopefully I'll see you in 2 weeks for Susan's Canal Side Walk. Take care now. Bye. Thanks, everybody. Bye.